In the ancient world, one institution stood above all others as a symbol of human knowledge and intellectual ambition. The Library of Alexandria wasn't merely a collection of books. It was the closest thing the ancient world had to a universal repository of human understanding. For nearly 7 centuries, from approximately 300 BCE to the 4th century CE, this institution served as the intellectual heart of the Mediterranean world. Scholars traveled from across 3 continents to study there. Kings invested fortunes to expand its collections, and within its walls, some of the most important scientific and literary work of antiquity was conducted. Then it vanished. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria represents one of history's most significant intellectual catastrophes. But the popular narrative of a single dramatic fire consuming centuries of knowledge in a single night is almost certainly false. The reality was more complex, more gradual, and in many ways more tragic. What was this institution actually? How did it function? What did it contain? And most importantly, what did humanity lose when it disappeared? These questions have occupied historians for centuries. The answers require examining fragmentary evidence, conflicting ancient accounts, and the broader context of Hellenistic civilization. What emerges is a story not of dramatic destruction, but of slow decline. Not of a single catastrophe, but of multiple losses over centuries. Not of villains destroying knowledge, but of changing circumstances that made preservation increasingly difficult. This is the documented history of the Library of Alexandria. Not the myth, but the evidence-based reconstruction of what we can actually know about one of antiquity's most important institutions. To understand the Library of Alexandria, we must first understand the world that created it. The library didn't emerge from nowhere. It was a product of specific political, cultural, and intellectual circumstances in the wake of Alexander the Great's conquests. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE at age 32, he left an empire stretching from Greece to India, but no clear succession plan. His generals, known as the Diadochi or successors, immediately began competing for control. The resulting wars of the Diadochi would reshape the ancient world for the next 40 years. One of these generals, Ptolemy son of Lagus, secured Egypt as his domain. This was a strategically astute choice. Egypt was wealthy, defensible, and had millennia of administrative tradition that could be adapted to Greek rule. Ptolemy established himself not merely as a foreign conqueror, but as pharaoh, adopting Egyptian religious practices while maintaining Greek culture for administration and military affairs. In 331 BCE, Alexander had founded a city on Egypt's Mediterranean coast, Alexandria. Under Ptolemaic rule, this city grew rapidly into one of the ancient world's great urban centers. Its location was ideal: 2 natural harbors, access to the Nile through canals, and command of trade routes connecting the Mediterranean with the Red Sea, and thus Europe, Africa, and Asia. The Ptolemies understood that military power alone wouldn't secure their dynasty's prestige. Cultural achievement mattered. Patronage of learning demonstrated sophistication and attracted talent. A king who sponsored scholarship gained reputation that mere conquest couldn't provide. This wasn't purely cynical calculation. The early Ptolemies, particularly Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II, appear to have genuinely valued learning. They created an environment where intellectual work was supported not for immediate practical benefit, but for its own sake. This combination of political utility and genuine intellectual interest created ideal conditions for something unprecedented. Before Alexandria, libraries had existed in various forms across the ancient Near East. Mesopotamian civilizations had preserved cuneiform tablets in administrative archives for millennia. The Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, established in the 7th century BCE, contained thousands of clay tablets covering literature, medicine, astronomy, and administrative records. In Greece, private book collections had become fashionable among wealthy intellectuals. Aristotle, teacher of Alexander the Great, assembled an extensive personal library covering all fields of knowledge he studied. When Aristotle died in 322 BCE, this collection passed to his successor, Theophrastus. The Ptolemies aimed for something more ambitious. They envisioned a library containing not just Greek literature, but texts from all civilizations, a universal collection representing the full scope of human knowledge. Nothing on this scale had been attempted before. The model, at least partially, came from Aristotle's institution in Athens, the Lyceum, where he had taught, surrounded by his collected texts. The Ptolemies essentially attempted to recreate and expand this model, with royal resources making possible what private means couldn't achieve. The result was the museum and its associated library. The museum, literally Temple of the Muses, was a research institute where scholars lived and worked under royal patronage. The library was its central resource, the tool that made scholarly work possible at unprecedented scale. The exact founding date of the library is lost, which is ironic for an institution dedicated to preserving information. What survives are later accounts, often contradictory, and reasonable inferences from circumstantial evidence. The earliest extended account appears in the letter of Aristeas, composed around 180 to 145 BCE, over a century after the events it purports to describe. According to this source, Ptolemy I established the library and appointed Demetrius of Phalerum to organize it. Demetrius was a significant figure, an Athenian orator and philosopher who had governed Athens from 317 to 307 BCE. When political circumstances forced him into exile, Ptolemy offered refuge. As a former student of Theophrastus, Aristotle's successor, Demetrius had direct connection to peripatetic philosophical traditions and library practices. However, modern scholarship questions the letter of Aristeas's reliability. The text was written long after the events, has clear propagandistic purposes, and contains chronological problems. More likely, the library reached full development under Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who ruled from 283 to 246 BCE, by which time Demetrius had fallen from favor. What we know more certainly is the library's eventual structure and function. It was located in Alexandria's royal quarter, the Bruchaion, as part of the museum complex. The geographer Strabo, who visited Alexandria around 20 BCE, described the museum's facilities, covered walkways, gardens, a large communal dining hall, lecture rooms, and meeting spaces. The scholars who worked there received royal salaries, free lodging and meals, and tax exemptions. This patronage system was revolutionary. For perhaps the first time, intellectual work was funded as a profession independent of teaching fees or private wealth. Scholars could devote themselves entirely to research and writing. The arrangement anticipated modern research universities in several ways. Like universities, it brought together experts across disciplines. Like research institutes, it freed scholars from financial concerns. And like any academic community, it fostered both collaboration and competition. The library building itself housed reading rooms, storage facilities for scrolls, and workspace for cataloging and copying. The exact architecture is unknown, as no archaeological remains have been definitively identified. 2 millennia of continuous occupation have obliterated earlier structures. The collection's contents were extraordinary. The Ptolemies pursued aggressive acquisition. They dispatched agents throughout the Mediterranean world with substantial funds to purchase texts at book fairs and from private collections. Early versions of works were preferred over later copies on the theory that they contained fewer transcription errors. This scholarly approach anticipated modern textual criticism. According to accounts by the physician Galen, writing in the 2nd century CE, Ptolemy II implemented remarkable acquisition methods. All ships docking at Alexandria were searched for books. Any discovered were confiscated, copied, and catalogued. The originals were kept. Copies were returned to owners. This practice, essentially literary piracy, was extraordinarily effective. The library particularly sought Homer's poems. Multiple versions existed, as the Iliad and Odyssey had been transmitted orally before being written down. The library collected every available version, cataloging them by origin. One scholar noted that each copy was labeled with its provenance: the ship version, the Athenian version, and so forth. Greek literature was the primary focus, but ambitions were universal. Texts were collected in multiple languages. Translation projects brought foreign works into Greek. The most famous was the Septuagint, the Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures, undertaken during Ptolemy II's reign according to tradition. The collection also included scientific and technical works, medical texts, mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, geographical accounts, engineering manuals. The goal was comprehensive coverage of human knowledge. Collection size estimates from ancient sources vary wildly: 400,000 scrolls in some accounts, 500,000 in others, some claiming even 700,000. These numbers should be treated skeptically. A single literary work might occupy multiple scrolls, so even hundreds of thousands of scrolls might represent tens of thousands of distinct works. More significant than raw numbers was organization. The library developed systematic cataloging under Callimachus of Cyrene, one of its early scholars. Callimachus created the Pinnaces, or tables, a 120-volume catalog organizing holdings by author and genre. This was monumental intellectual achievement. The Pinnaces provided the first comprehensive bibliography of Greek literature. It listed authors alphabetically within categories, gave biographical information, and identified works by opening lines or other characteristics. It essentially invented bibliography as a discipline and established principles still used today. The cataloging system enabled efficient location of materials. It provided synoptic views of fields, enabling comparative study. And it preserved information about works that later disappeared, so we know many lost texts only through Callimachus's catalog entries. The library and museum together formed a unique institution. Scholars conducted individual research, but also collaborated on joint projects. They had unprecedented resources and intellectual stimulation from colleagues across disciplines. The environment must have been extraordinarily productive, competitive, creative, and intensely focused on intellectual achievement. Over its operational lifetime, the library and museum attracted the leading intellectuals of the Hellenistic world. Their work shaped ancient science, literature, and philosophy in ways that influenced human thought for centuries. The first documented head of the library was Zenodotus of Ephesus, serving from approximately 325 to 270 BCE. Zenodotus pioneered textual scholarship, working to establish accurate texts of Homer's poems. The Iliad and Odyssey existed in numerous variant versions, having been transmitted orally before written recording. Zenodotus compared manuscripts, identified interpolations and corruptions, and attempted to determine what Homer had actually written. Rather than treating all manuscripts as equally authoritative, he applied scholarly judgment to determine accuracy. This critical approach was revolutionary, essentially inventing textual criticism as a discipline. He developed the practice of marking suspected spurious lines with critical signs rather than deleting them, preserving variant readings while indicating scholarly judgment. Modern textual editors still employ similar methods. Callimachus of Cyrene, working at the library around the same period, created the Pinakes catalogue mentioned earlier. Besides this organizational achievement, Callimachus was a distinguished poet whose works set standards for Hellenistic poetry. Though only fragments survive, ancient critics ranked him among Greek literature's greatest figures. Apollonius of Rhodes, who became head around 270 BCE, authored the Argonautica, an epic poem about Jason and the Argonauts. This is one of the few complete Hellenistic epics to survive, providing crucial evidence for literary developments in the period. Ancient sources mention scholarly disputes between Apollonius and his former teacher, Callimachus, regarding proper epic style. Whether such conflicts actually forced Apollonius to relocate to Rhodes is uncertain, but the accounts illustrate that the museum wasn't always harmonious. Intellectual disagreements could become personal conflicts. The fourth head of the library was Eratosthenes of Cyrene, one of antiquity's most remarkable polymaths. Taking charge around 245 BCE, Eratosthenes made significant contributions to multiple fields: mathematics, geography, astronomy, philosophy, and poetry. His most famous achievement was calculating Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. Eratosthenes knew that at noon on the summer solstice, the sun was directly overhead at Syene, modern Aswan, casting no shadow. In Alexandria, several hundred miles north, the sun's angle created measurable shadows. By measuring shadow angles in Alexandria and knowing the distance to Syene, Eratosthenes calculated Earth's curvature and thus its circumference. His result was approximately 39,250 kilometers, close to the actual equatorial circumference of 40,075 kilometers. This was achieved over 17 centuries before Columbus, definitively proving ancient Greeks understood Earth's spherical shape. Eratosthenes also created systematic world maps, dividing the known world into latitude and longitude grids. His geographical work, the Geographica, became a standard reference. Though it doesn't survive complete, later geographers drew heavily upon it. In mathematics, he developed the sieve of Eratosthenes, an algorithm for identifying prime numbers still used today. He contributed to number theory and geometry, advancing Alexandria's flourishing mathematical tradition. Ancient authors called him Beta, second best in everything, suggesting excellence across fields without quite achieving absolute supremacy in any single discipline. This seems harsh, given his achievements, but it illustrates Alexandria's competitive intellectual culture. Aristophanes of Byzantium, leading the library around 195 BCE, continued textual scholarship traditions. He's credited with inventing Greek accent marks and punctuation, standardizing written Greek. These technical developments significantly improved readability and reduced textual ambiguity. Aristophanes worked in lexicography, studying word meanings and usage empirically rather than through philosophical speculation. This approach anticipated modern linguistic methods. Aristarchus of Samothrace, perhaps antiquity's greatest textual scholar, became head around 175 BCE. His editions of Homer became standard for centuries. He developed sophisticated critical systems for marking textual problems and indicating preferred readings. Aristarchus's work required enormous erudition, knowledge of Greek dialects, grammar, mythology, geography, and literary tradition. His commentaries on Homer filled multiple volumes, examining every line in detail with linguistic and historical analysis. His career ended in political crisis. In 145 BCE, succession disputes embroiled him in royal intrigue. When his preferred candidate Ptolemy VII was killed and succeeded by Ptolemy VIII, Aristarchus fled to Cyprus, where he died shortly after. This political upheaval marked a turning point. Ptolemy VIII, paranoid about opposition, expelled many intellectuals from Alexandria. The resulting brain drain was catastrophic. Scholars like Aristarchus fled to Rhodes, Pergamon, and other cities, taking expertise with them. The library continued functioning, but never fully recovered its concentration of leading minds. Medical research also flourished at Alexandria. Herophilus and Erasistratus, pioneering anatomists working in the 3rd century BCE, conducted studies advancing understanding of human physiology. They performed dissections, gaining knowledge of internal organs that wouldn't be matched for centuries. Herophilus identified the brain, not the heart, as the seat of intelligence. He distinguished sensory and motor nerves. He studied the circulatory system, identifying arteries and veins as distinct structures. His work laid foundations for later medical science. Erasistratus studied cardiac structure and function, describing valves and chambers. He theorized about blood circulation without fully understanding the complete circuit. He distinguished arterial and venous systems, recognizing different functions. These advances were possible partly through library resources. Herophilus and Erasistratus consulted medical texts from throughout the ancient world. Greek, Egyptian, and Near Eastern traditions. They built on accumulated knowledge while conducting original research. Mathematics and astronomy also thrived. Euclid worked in Alexandria, and his Elements became history's most influential mathematics textbook. For over 2 millennia, it was the standard introduction to geometry. Even today, school geometry is essentially Euclidean. Aristarchus of Samos, working around 270 BCE, proposed a heliocentric model with Earth and planets orbiting the Sun. This theory, though not widely accepted in antiquity, anticipated Copernicus by 17 centuries. Aristarchus's mathematical approach to astronomy established methods that dominated the field. Hipparchus, perhaps antiquity's greatest observational astronomer, worked in Alexandria and Rhodes in the 2nd century BCE. He developed precise instruments for measuring star positions and planetary motions. His star catalogue listed over 850 stars with coordinates. He discovered axial precession, Earth's slow wobble, causing star positions to shift over centuries. Hipparchus refined mathematical techniques for astronomy, developing spherical trigonometry and computational methods enabling accurate predictions. His work was later synthesized by Claudius Ptolemy in the Almagest, which became the standard astronomical text for over a millennium. In engineering, Hero of Alexandria made remarkable contributions in the 1st century CE. He invented numerous devices, a primitive steam engine called an eolipile, automated theater systems, mechanical puppets, and war machines. His works on pneumatics, automata, and mathematics showed remarkable ingenuity. Hero's inventions were often entertaining demonstrations or temple mechanisms rather than practical machines, but they demonstrated principles later applied in industrial technology. His steam engine, though a toy, embodied the principle that would eventually power the Industrial Revolution. The breadth of work is staggering. Literature, philology, mathematics, astronomy, geography, medicine, engineering, philosophy. The library's resources enabled scholarship across all fields. Scholars consulted works by predecessors, compared approaches, and built on accumulated knowledge. This was the library's true value, not just preserving texts, but enabling intellectual work. A mathematician could find earlier geometric proofs and extend them. A geographer could consult travel accounts and construct better maps. A physician could study case histories and compare treatments. A poet could read earlier literature and develop new styles. The library was more than a repository. It was an engine of knowledge creation, where information became understanding, and understanding generated new knowledge. This is what humanity lost. Not just texts, though those were precious, but an institutional model for organizing and supporting scholarly work. The library's decline began not with dramatic destruction, but with gradual erosion of the conditions that made it possible. Political, economic, and cultural changes over centuries weakened the institution before any catastrophic events occurred. The first documented threat came in 48 BCE during Julius Caesar's involvement in Egyptian politics. This incident is well attested in ancient sources, though its exact impact on the library remains debated. Caesar had arrived in Alexandria pursuing his defeated rival Pompey after the Battle of Pharsalus. He found himself embroiled in succession disputes between Cleopatra VII and her brother Ptolemy XIII. Supporting Cleopatra, Caesar provoked military response from Ptolemy's faction. Besieged in the palace quarter with limited forces, Caesar ordered ships in the harbor burned to prevent the Egyptian fleet from using them against him. Multiple ancient sources, including Caesar's own account, Plutarch's biography, and Dio Cassius's history, record this tactical decision. The fire spread from the docks into adjacent areas. Several sources specifically mention damage to book collections. Seneca the Younger, writing approximately a century later, claimed 40,000 books were destroyed. Plutarch mentions fire spreading to warehouses storing books. The extent of damage to the main library is uncertain. Some historians argue only export warehouses near the docks were affected, not the main collection in the museum. Others contend the fire reached the main library, causing significant losses. The debate hinges partly on later evidence. Strabo visited Alexandria around 20 BCE, 2 decades after Caesar's fire, and described the museum without mentioning recent catastrophe. This suggests either the main library wasn't severely damaged or substantial rebuilding had occurred. What seems clear is that losses occurred in 48 BCE. The question is magnitude. Seneca's figure of 40,000 scrolls, if accurate, would represent substantial damage even to a very large collection. Whether this was the main library or a satellite facility remains uncertain. Mark Antony, Caesar's ally and later Cleopatra's political partner, reportedly attempted compensation by giving Cleopatra 200,000 volumes from Pergamon's library around 41 to 30 BCE. This suggests perceived need to rebuild the collection. However, this account appears only in Plutarch, who notes it came from hostile sources, making its reliability questionable. Regardless of Caesar's fire's extent, the library clearly continued functioning for centuries afterward. Scholars continued producing work. The institution remained active through the first few centuries CE, but underlying conditions were deteriorating. Several factors contributed to gradual decline. First, political instability weakened royal patronage. Later, Ptolemy's focused on maintaining power amid Roman interference rather than cultural projects. Resources supporting the museum were diverted to military and political purposes. Second, Rome's conquest of Egypt in 30 BCE fundamentally altered Alexandria's status. From being capital of an independent kingdom whose rulers derived prestige from cultural patronage, it became a province administered by Roman governors focused on grain extraction and order maintenance. Institutional support structures maintaining the library eroded. Under Roman rule, the position of library head became increasingly political rather than scholarly. Instead of distinguished intellectuals, appointments went to administratively connected figures. Qualifications shifted from academic achievement to political loyalty. Third, intellectual culture was shifting. By the 1st century CE, scholarship's cutting edge was moving elsewhere. Rome attracted scholars with patronage opportunities. Other cities developed libraries and research communities. Alexandria was no longer uniquely central. Fourth, Christianity's rise introduced new tensions. The museum and library were associated with pagan Greek learning, which Christians viewed ambivalently. While some Christian scholars valued classical education, others saw pagan philosophy as irrelevant or dangerous to faith. These factors combined to create gradual decline rather than sudden destruction. Funding decreased, acquisitions slowed, buildings deteriorated, the scholarly community dispersed. It was death by accumulated neglect rather than single catastrophe. Additional destructive events occurred over subsequent centuries, each removing more of what remained. Beyond Caesar's 48 BCE fire, several other destructive events are associated with the library's final disappearance. Separating documented facts from later legends requires careful analysis of sources and their reliability. A significant documented event occurred in 272 CE during Emperor Aurelian's reconquest of Alexandria from the breakaway Palmyrene Empire. Aurelian's forces besieged the city and fought urban battles. The Bruchian Quarter, where the museum and library were located, suffered heavy damage. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the late 4th century, explicitly mentions Bruchian's destruction during Aurelian's campaign. If library buildings were still standing and functional, this military action likely damaged or destroyed them. However, by this point, the institution was already in advanced decline. Another destructive episode occurred in 297 CE, when Emperor Diocletian besieged Alexandria to suppress revolt. Again, intense fighting in the city center caused widespread destruction. Any remaining library facilities would likely have been damaged in this conflict. These military events occurred during a period when the museum and library were already shadows of their former status. References to scholarly activity there become sparse in the 3rd century. The institution may have been largely defunct before these catastrophes. Then comes the most controversial narrative: destruction by religious zealotry, specifically the claim involving Christian destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE. The Serapeum was a temple complex that housed a daughter library associated with the main library. Located in Alexandria's Egyptian quarter rather than the Greek Bruchion, it had become a center of pagan intellectual life as Christianity gained dominance. In 391 CE, following imperial edicts against paganism, the Patriarch of Alexandria Theophilus, with imperial support, orchestrated the Serapeum's destruction. Christian mobs attacked the temple. Pagan statues were destroyed. The site was converted to Christian use. The question is whether this included destruction of books housed there. Historical sources are frustratingly ambiguous. Several writers describe the Serapeum's demolition, but don't specifically mention books. The 5th century pagan historian Eunapius mentions the library's destruction, but provides no details. The Christian historian Orosius, writing around 417 CE, states he saw empty bookcases in temple remains, suggesting books had been removed before or during destruction. The lack of specific contemporary accounts of book burning is notable. Critics of Theophilus might be expected to highlight such vandalism if it occurred. The silence could indicate books weren't destroyed, or that by 391 CE, the collection was diminished enough not to warrant special mention. A more dramatic narrative emerged in later centuries. The claim that Muslim conquest of Alexandria in 641 CE resulted in deliberate library destruction. This story first appears in writings of Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi in the 13th century, over 600 years after the supposed events. According to this narrative, Caliph Omar, hearing Alexandria had a great library, ordered it burned, reasoning that books contradicting the Quran were heretical, while those agreeing with it were superfluous. Books were supposedly used as bathhouse fuel for 6 months. Modern historians overwhelmingly reject this as legend. It appears too late in sources, contradicts earlier Islamic accounts that don't mention such events, and conflicts with Islamic civilization's documented preservation of classical texts. Early Islamic scholars highly valued Greek philosophical and scientific works, translating them into Arabic. Moreover, the library had almost certainly ceased existing centuries before Muslim conquest. No sources from the crucial period between 272 CE and 641 CE definitively place a functioning library in Alexandria. References to the museum and library disappear from historical records after the 3rd century. The most likely scenario is gradual decline, punctuated by catastrophes. Losses in Caesar's 48 BCE fire, extent uncertain. Gradual decline under Roman rule, from 30 BCE onward. Reduced funding and institutional support over centuries. Damage during Aurelian's 272 CE campaign. Further damage during Diocletian's 297 CE siege. Destruction of the Serapeum and its collection in 391 CE. Final disappearance of remnants in subsequent centuries. This pattern is less dramatic than single catastrophic destruction, but more realistic. Great institutions rarely vanish overnight. They decline as circumstances change, support erodes, and priorities shift. Occasional catastrophes accelerate the process, but underlying causes are systemic. Various destruction narratives often served ideological purposes. Christians blamed pagans or Muslims. Muslims blamed Christians. Enlightenment thinkers blamed religious zealotry generally. Each narrative fit the teller's larger interpretation of civilization and its challenges. Historical reality was messier and less morally clear. Multiple factors over centuries contributed to the library's disappearance. No single villain destroyed it. Rather, changing circumstances made survival increasingly difficult until, at some undocumented point, it ceased to exist. The central question remains: what did humanity actually lose when the library disappeared? This is harder to answer than might initially seem apparent. We cannot catalogue what we don't know is missing. The nature of the loss means we're largely unaware of its extent. It's analogous to asking someone with amnesia to describe forgotten memories. But informed estimates are possible based on references in surviving works to lost texts, on the general scope of ancient literature and science, and on occasional rediscoveries showing what had been temporarily lost. Consider literature first. The library held works by hundreds of Greek poets, dramatists, and prose writers. Most ancient Greek literature is lost. Of tragic drama, we possess 7 complete plays by Aeschylus. From approximately 90, he wrote. We have 7 by Sophocles, from over 120. We have 19 by Euripides, from approximately 90. These survival rates are typical. For most ancient authors, we have fragments quoted by later writers or nothing at all. Entire genres have nearly vanished. Greek lyric poetry, once extensive and diverse, survives primarily in fragments. Of 9 canonical lyric poets, we have substantial work from only one, Pindar, and even his corpus is incomplete. Comedy fares slightly better due to later popularity, but still most is lost. Of old comedy, we have 11 complete plays by Aristophanes, from over 40 he wrote, plus fragments of other playwrights. Middle and New Comedy are almost entirely lost except for Menander, of whom we have 1 complete play and substantial fragments of others. Prose literature shows similar losses. We have fragments of hundreds of historians' works. Pre-Socratic philosophers survive mainly through later quotations. Entire philosophical schools are known only through hostile accounts by opponents. The Library of Alexandria held complete or more complete versions of these works. When it disappeared, so did unique copies of texts that would never be recovered. Scientific and technical literature suffered similar losses, perhaps worse. Ancient science was cumulative, with later workers building on predecessors. When earlier works were lost, later developments became incomprehensible. Consider astronomy. We know Hipparchus made detailed observations and calculations. His star catalogue was used by later astronomers, but his original works are almost entirely lost. We know them only through Ptolemy's Almagest, written centuries later. How much did Ptolemy preserve? How much did he modify? We cannot know. In mathematics, we're slightly more fortunate. Euclid's Elements survived because it became a standard textbook, copied repeatedly. But many other mathematical works disappeared. We know of them through references, but cannot study the actual content. Medical knowledge suffered catastrophic losses. Ancient medicine was empirical, based on accumulated case histories and treatment observations. When medical texts were lost, this accumulated experience vanished. Medieval medicine had to partially rediscover what ancient physicians had known. Herophilus and Erasistratus, the pioneering anatomists, wrote extensively. Almost nothing survives directly. We know their work through later medical writers, but how accurately later accounts represent original research is uncertain. Engineering and technological knowledge also disappeared. Hero of Alexandria's works partially survive, showing remarkable technical sophistication. But he represented a tradition of engineering knowledge, much of which is lost. We know ancient engineers built sophisticated devices and structures, but detailed technical knowledge often disappeared. The loss extended beyond Greek works. The library collected texts from other civilizations. What became of Egyptian astronomical and medical texts, Babylonian mathematical and astronomical tablets, Phoenician historical accounts, Persian royal records? Most are simply gone. The library's catalogue, Callimachus's Pinakes, itself disappeared. This 120-volume bibliography of Greek literature would be invaluable today. It listed works, provided biographical information on authors, and gave opening lines for identification. Much of what we know about lost works comes from later references to the Pinakes, but the actual catalogue is lost. Some losses were later reversed. Many Greek texts survived only in Arabic translation. When Islamic scholars conquered former Byzantine territories, they found Greek manuscripts and translated important scientific and philosophical works into Arabic. These translations preserved content that had disappeared from Greek. Later, during the Renaissance, European scholars retranslated these Arabic versions back into Latin and eventually Greek. Some works survive only through this circuitous route: Greek original to Arabic translation to Latin retranslation. Each transmission introduced changes, but content was preserved when the Greek original had vanished. Other works disappeared entirely from all traditions. We know they existed through references, but no copy survived anywhere. These represent absolute losses, knowledge that will never be recovered. The quantitative estimate is sobering. Of ancient Greek literature, perhaps 90% is lost. Of scientific and technical literature, the percentage may be even higher. The Library of Alexandria held many of these lost works. When it disappeared, so did unique copies that could have preserved them. But numbers don't capture the full impact. Consider what specific losses mean. To understand what the library's destruction actually cost, examining specific losses is more illuminating than general statistics. Consider Aristarchus of Samos's heliocentric theory. We know he proposed that Earth and planets orbit the Sun, written in a treatise around 270 BCE. But the actual text is lost. We know it existed only through references by other ancient writers, particularly Archimedes. What arguments did Aristarchus make? What calculations supported his theory? What objections did he address? We don't know. When his work was lost, humanity lost detailed heliocentric arguments that might have accelerated acceptance when Copernicus proposed the same idea 17 centuries later. The medical works of Herophilus and Erasistratus are another significant loss. These physicians pioneered human dissection, gaining anatomical knowledge that wouldn't be recovered until the Renaissance. They described the brain's structure, distinguished nerves, studied the circulatory system. But their detailed findings are lost. We know they existed through later medical writers who referenced them, but the actual observations and descriptions disappeared. When Renaissance anatomists like Vesalius began dissecting again, they had to rediscover what Herophilus and Erasistratus had already documented. How much medical progress was delayed by this loss? If detailed anatomical knowledge had been continuously available, would medical science have advanced centuries earlier? The counterfactual is unprovable, but the loss was clearly significant. The technical knowledge loss is harder to quantify, but potentially enormous. Ancient engineers built sophisticated structures and machines. The Antikythera mechanism, a complex astronomical calculator from around 100 BCE, shows remarkable technical capability. But who built it? How did they design it? What other devices existed? We don't know, because technical knowledge often wasn't written down, or the texts didn't survive. When oral traditions and practical knowledge were disrupted, technical capability declined. Medieval Europe couldn't match Roman engineering in many areas, not because medieval engineers were less intelligent, but because accumulated technical knowledge had been lost. Historical knowledge also suffered. Many ancient civilizations wrote histories that no longer exist. We know about them only through brief references in surviving works. Berossus, a Babylonian priest, wrote a history of Babylon in Greek around 280 BCE. Almost nothing survives, but it would provide invaluable information about Mesopotamian history and culture. Manetho, an Egyptian priest contemporary with Berossus, wrote a history of Egypt. Again, almost nothing survives directly, though later writers excerpted portions. How much richer would our understanding of ancient Egypt be, with complete access to Manetho's work, written by someone who could read hieroglyphics and had access to temple records? The loss of alternative philosophical traditions is significant. We have substantial works from Platonists and Aristotelians because these schools remained influential and their texts were continuously copied. But many other philosophical schools are known only through hostile accounts by opponents. The Epicureans left almost nothing directly. We have Lucretius's poem De Rerum Natura, written in Latin, and some letters and fragments of Epicurus. But the extensive works of Epicurean philosophy that filled library shelves are gone. The Stoics are slightly better preserved, but still most is lost. Early Stoic works exist only in fragments. We have more from later Roman Stoics like Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, but the Greek Stoic tradition is largely lost. Most significantly, we've lost diversity of thought. Surviving texts were preserved because later generations found them useful or important. Works that didn't fit dominant intellectual traditions were less likely to be copied and more likely to disappear. This creates survivorship bias. Our view of ancient thought is skewed toward what later Christians and Muslims found valuable or at least acceptable. Alternative traditions, heterodox ideas, and competing frameworks largely disappeared. The library contained this diversity. When it vanished, so did access to the full range of ancient intellectual life. We're left with a curated selection, shaped by later preservation priorities, rather than reflecting the actual intellectual landscape of antiquity. The loss of mathematical works represents another significant gap in human knowledge. We possess Euclid's Elements because it became a standard textbook, copied repeatedly across centuries. But many other mathematical treatises disappeared entirely. Apollonius of Perga wrote extensively on conic sections, advanced geometry dealing with curves produced by intersecting planes and cones. Some of his work survives, but much is lost. We know from references that he developed sophisticated techniques that would have to be rediscovered much later. Archimedes, perhaps antiquity's greatest mathematician, worked in Syracuse, but his texts were preserved partially through copies that reached Alexandria. We have several of his treatises, but others are known only through references. The Method, one of his most important works, was lost for centuries until a palimpsest was discovered in 1906, a manuscript where the original text had been scraped off and replaced with a prayer book in the medieval period. This palimpsest had survived only by chance. The parchment was reused because it was valuable, and the original text was considered unimportant by medieval scribes. How many other mathematical works were similarly destroyed, written over, or simply discarded because later generations didn't recognize their value? Geographical knowledge also suffered massive losses. Ancient explorers and merchants traveled extensively, recording observations. Pytheas of Massalia sailed to Britain and possibly Iceland in the 4th century BCE, writing an account of his journey. The text is lost. We know it existed only through later references and brief quotations. How many other travel accounts disappeared? What did ancient explorers know about Africa's interior, the Atlantic Ocean, or Asia beyond India? We have hints from surviving texts, but the detailed accounts that filled the library's shelves are gone. The loss of literary works is emotionally impactful, even if less practically significant than scientific losses. Consider Sappho, the great lyric poet of archaic Greece. Ancient scholars collected her poetry in 9 books. We have one complete poem and fragments of others, mostly recovered from papyrus scraps in Egyptian garbage dumps. What we have is beautiful. What we've lost must have been equally extraordinary, but it's simply gone. Sappho's voice, one of the few female voices from ancient Greece, is almost entirely silenced by these losses. Or consider the lost plays. Greek theatre was the foundation of Western dramatic tradition. But of hundreds of tragedies and comedies performed in Athens alone, only a tiny fraction survives complete. We have 33 complete tragedies from 3 playwrights. We have 11 complete comedies from 1 playwright. Everything else is fragments or nothing. Each lost play represents not just text, but a unique perspective, a different approach to storytelling, a distinct artistic vision. When the library burned or crumbled or was simply abandoned, these voices were silenced forever. The cumulative effect of these losses is profound. Ancient civilization was far more intellectually sophisticated than the fragmented surviving evidence suggests. When we read Ptolemy's astronomy or Galen's medicine, we're seeing the end point of long developmental chains. Earlier stages are mostly lost. This creates distortions in how we understand ancient thought. We see conclusions without the full process that led to them. We see mature theories without the debates and alternatives that were rejected. We see finished products without the experimental failures that preceded them. The library contained this missing context. It held not just final authoritative texts, but competing theories, alternative approaches, and developmental stages. When it disappeared, we lost not just information, but the intellectual context that made that information meaningful. Modern scholars attempt to reconstruct lost works from fragments and references. This painstaking work can sometimes recover substantial information, but it's always incomplete. A reference to a lost work tells us it existed, perhaps gives a brief description, but can't replace the actual text. The tragedy is that much of this was preventable. Many texts survived into late antiquity or even the early medieval period. They were lost, not because all copies were burned in a single catastrophe, but because nobody bothered to copy them again. Parchment and papyrus deteriorate. Without continuous copying, texts disappear. When the library disappeared, it removed a major hub of copying and preservation. Texts that existed in multiple copies were safer, but rare works held perhaps only in Alexandria vanished entirely. The library's destruction didn't just destroy its contents, it disrupted preservation networks that might have saved works through other routes. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria isn't merely historical tragedy. It resonates with contemporary concerns about knowledge preservation, institutional fragility, and the permanence of digital information. Modern society produces vastly more information than any ancient civilization. Digital technology enables storage and transmission on scales that would have been incomprehensible to Alexandrian librarians. Yet modern information is, paradoxically, more fragile than ancient texts in certain respects. Consider digital preservation challenges. Modern data exists primarily in electronic formats, requiring specific hardware and software to access. File formats become obsolete. Storage media degrades. Without active maintenance and migration to new formats, digital information can become inaccessible within decades. Papyrus scrolls, by contrast, can survive millennia under the right conditions. We can read ancient texts directly if we have the physical artifact and knowledge of the language. Digital files require multiple layers of technology to access: functional hardware, compatible software, knowledge of file formats, and electrical power. This creates vulnerability. If technological systems fail catastrophically, digital information could be lost on scales, making Alexandria's losses seem modest. We've created a civilization dependent on digital information without ensuring its long-term preservation. The Library of Alexandria represented centralized knowledge storage. all the world's learning in one institution. This created vulnerability. When that single point failed, everything it uniquely held was lost. Modern information systems are more distributed, with multiple copies in different locations providing redundancy. Yet centralization persists in new forms. Google controls access to enormous amounts of information. Amazon Web Services hosts vast portions of the Internet. A handful of companies dominate digital infrastructure. If these centralized systems failed, the consequences could be catastrophic. Libraries and archives still exist, still perform crucial preservation functions, but they're often underfunded, treated as less essential than they actually are. Digital materials receive less preservation attention than physical objects, partly because digital seems permanent when actually it's fragile. The Internet Archive, founded in 1996, attempts comprehensive web preservation, archiving billions of web pages, books, videos, and software. This modern Alexandria faces similar challenges: scale, funding, legal obstacles, and technological change. Like the ancient library, it depends on institutional support that could erode. Several incidents illustrate ongoing vulnerability. In 2013, fire at a Korean data center destroyed customer data, much of it permanently. In 2018, fire at Brazil's National Museum destroyed millions of artifacts and records. Digital backups existed for some materials, but not all. These weren't ancient catastrophes. They happened recently in technologically advanced societies. More insidious is gradual loss through neglect. Websites disappear when domain registrations lapse. Digital archives shut down when funding ends. File formats become obsolete, and documents become inaccessible. This slow erosion mirrors how the Library of Alexandria likely declined, not through sudden catastrophe, but through accumulated neglect. The challenge of preserving digital information differs from preserving physical texts, but shares fundamental similarities. Both require ongoing institutional support, resource allocation, and recognition of preservation's importance. Both are vulnerable to funding cuts, political instability, and changing priorities. Modern society has technological advantages ancient Alexandria lacked. We understand information degradation. We can create redundant copies distributed globally. We can convert between formats. But we must actually do these things, and institutional will and resources are often lacking. Libraries worldwide hold millions of books slowly degrading. Acid in paper, produced in the 19th and 20th centuries, causes self-destruction. Without intervention, these books will crumble. Digital reformatting can preserve content, but it's expensive and labor-intensive. Many books will be lost simply because nobody prioritizes saving them. Academic journals contain crucial research, but access often depends on subscription databases controlled by private companies. If a database provider goes out of business, what happens to their archives? Some preservation arrangements exist, but they're not comprehensive. Crucial research could become inaccessible. The open access movement attempts to ensure research remains freely available, but it struggles against established publishing models and funding structures. Vast amounts of publicly funded research remain locked behind paywalls, accessible only through institutional subscriptions. These issues echo Alexandria's fundamental problem. Knowledge preservation requires institutional support and resource allocation. When support erodes, preservation fails. The difference is that modern society has far more knowledge to lose. Languages present another preservation challenge. Approximately 7,000 languages are currently spoken. Linguists estimate that half may disappear by 2100 as speakers die without passing languages to new generations. Each lost language represents unique knowledge, cultural practices, environmental understanding, and ways of conceptualizing reality. Some efforts exist to document endangered languages, but resources are inadequate relative to the scale of loss. When a language disappears, its literature, oral histories, and knowledge traditions vanish. This is happening now, an ongoing catastrophe comparable to Alexandria's destruction, but distributed across the globe. Indigenous knowledge systems face similar threats. Traditional ecological knowledge, developed over generations, is disappearing as traditional practices are abandoned. This knowledge often isn't written, existing in oral traditions and practical skills. When it's lost, it's gone permanently. Climate change threatens physical archives. Rising sea levels endanger coastal repositories. Extreme weather events damage collections. Temperature and humidity changes accelerate material degradation. Museums and libraries must invest in climate control and disaster preparedness, but many lack resources. The parallels to Alexandria are clear. An institution holding irreplaceable knowledge, dependent on political and economic support, vulnerable to catastrophe, at risk of gradual decline through neglect. The specific threats differ, but the fundamental challenge remains: how to ensure knowledge survives across generations when preservation requires constant effort and resources. Modern society has an advantage Alexandria lacked: awareness of the problem. We know knowledge can be lost. We understand preservation requirements. We have historical examples showing what happens when preservation fails. The question is whether we'll apply this knowledge to prevent future Alexandrias. Despite extensive scholarship attempting to reconstruct lost ancient knowledge, certain categories of information are simply irretrievable. Understanding what can never be recovered helps clarify the magnitude of what the library's destruction cost humanity. Primary sources are the most obvious, irreplaceable loss. When the only copy of a text disappears, that text is gone. Secondary sources may reference it, may quote brief passages, may describe its arguments, but the actual text, in the author's words with full detail and nuance, cannot be reconstructed. For many ancient authors, we have exactly this situation. We know their names. We know they wrote. Later writers reference them, but the actual works are simply gone. No amount of scholarly detective work can recreate what isn't there. Consider historiography. Ancient historians wrote accounts of events, incorporating documents, eyewitness testimony, and earlier historical works. When these histories were lost, we lost not just narrative, but source material. The primary documents they quoted, the eyewitness accounts they preserved, are gone. Polybius wrote 40 books of history covering the rise of Rome. Only the first 5 survive complete, plus fragments of others. The missing books contained detailed accounts of crucial events in Roman expansion. We know they existed. We cannot read them. Similarly, Livy wrote 142 books of Roman history. We have books 1 to 10 and 21 to 45. The rest, over 2/3 of the work, are lost. These missing books covered critical periods, including Rome's early republic and later empire. The information they contained is irretrievable. For scientific knowledge, the loss is even more frustrating because we can sometimes see that ancient scholars knew things that were later forgotten and had to be rediscovered. But without the texts, we can't access their reasoning or methods. Ancient astronomers made observations that would be valuable today. Long-term astronomical data helps understand celestial mechanics and historical changes in planetary orbits. Ancient observations could extend our baseline for comparison. but most are lost. We know Hipparchus created a star catalogue. We have Ptolemy's catalogue from centuries later, which drew on Hipparchus. But Hipparchus's original observations, with their different perspective and potentially different data, are mostly lost. Medical case histories represent another irreplaceable loss. Ancient physicians accumulated empirical knowledge through observation. They recorded symptoms, treatments, and outcomes. This accumulated clinical experience could still be valuable, but most is lost. We have some medical texts, but they're often theoretical treatises rather than detailed case histories. The practical knowledge, the specifics of individual cases, the nuanced understanding that comes from extensive clinical experience is largely gone. Technical knowledge is perhaps the most frustrating loss because we can see ancient engineering achievements but don't fully understand how they were accomplished. Roman concrete formulations, Greek bronze casting techniques, ancient navigation methods, much is lost or incompletely understood. Some has been reverse engineered. Modern analysis of surviving structures reveals construction techniques, but detailed written accounts of methods, the sort of information that would have been in technical manuals, is mostly gone. Cultural context is another irreplaceable loss. Ancient texts existed within cultural frameworks we only partially understand. References that would have been obvious to contemporary readers are obscure to us. Humor, irony, and subtle allusions are often lost. When we read surviving ancient texts, we're reading with incomplete understanding. The library would have contained works explaining cultural context, mythological references, and historical background. Without these, we're like someone reading modern literature without understanding contemporary culture. Linguistic information is similarly lost. Ancient Greek and Latin were living languages with nuances we can only partially recover. Pronunciation, colloquial usage, and dialectal variations are incompletely understood. The library would have contained works on language, grammar, and dialectology that would help us understand ancient languages better. Some losses affect how we understand entire fields. Ancient philosophy, for example, is known primarily through works that survived because later traditions found them useful. But many philosophical schools and approaches disappeared entirely. We know they existed through references, but can't study them directly. This creates gaps in intellectual history. We see surviving traditions without the alternatives they competed against. We see winners without losers. This distorts our understanding of how ancient thought developed. The same applies to religion. Ancient Mediterranean world contained diverse religious traditions. Most are known only through hostile accounts by Christians or through archaeological remains. The actual religious texts, theological arguments, and spiritual practices are largely lost. When the library disappeared, it took with it detailed accounts of religious traditions that would soon be suppressed. We lost primary sources for understanding ancient religious diversity, leaving us dependent on archaeological evidence and hostile accounts. Literary genres that didn't survive into the medieval period are largely lost. Ancient novels, for instance, were considered low entertainment. Few were copied. We have fragments of several ancient novels recovered from papyrus finds, suggesting a thriving genre. But most is gone. What was ancient popular culture like? What did ordinary people read for entertainment? We have hints, but not comprehensive understanding. The library would have contained popular literature alongside high culture, but preservation prioritized texts considered important, not necessarily representative. Music is entirely lost except for notation in a few cases. Ancient music theory survives in texts, but actual music, how it sounded, is irrecoverable. We can attempt reconstruction based on theoretical writings, but we cannot hear ancient compositions as ancient audiences heard them. The same applies to theatrical performance. We have play texts, but not performance traditions. How were ancient plays actually performed? What were acting styles? How was music integrated? We have some information from written sources, but the living performance tradition is gone. Perhaps most poignant is the loss of individual voices. Each lost text represents a person who thought, wrote, and attempted to communicate across time. When their work disappears, so does their voice. They become names in lists rather than living presences. We know hundreds of ancient authors by name. We know they wrote. We sometimes know what they wrote about, but we cannot hear their actual voices, cannot engage with their specific arguments, cannot appreciate their individual perspectives. They're silenced by time and the failure of preservation. This is what can never be recovered. The specific texts in their full detail, the primary sources without intermediaries, the cultural context that made texts meaningful, the living traditions that gave them life, and the individual voices of authors speaking across millennia. Scholarship can reconstruct some information from fragments. New discoveries occasionally recover lost texts, but for most of what disappeared from Alexandria, recovery is impossible. The loss is permanent. The Library of Alexandria's story offers clear lessons for contemporary society. These lessons concern not just library preservation, but fundamental questions about how civilizations maintain and transmit knowledge. First, knowledge preservation requires active, continuous effort. Information doesn't preserve itself. Physical texts decay without preservation work. Digital information requires migration to new formats. Institutions need maintenance, funding, and staffing. When these fail, information disappears. The library declined not primarily through catastrophic destruction, but through erosion of supporting institutions. Funding decreased. Political support wavered. Scholarly community dispersed. Buildings deteriorated. These gradual processes, not dramatic fires, likely caused most losses. Modern information systems face similar vulnerabilities. Digital preservation requires ongoing technical work. Libraries need consistent funding. Archives require professional staff. When resources are cut or priorities shift, preservation suffers. The losses may not be immediately apparent, but they're real. Second, centralized knowledge repositories create vulnerability. The library concentrated irreplaceable texts in one location. When that location failed, unique holdings were lost. Modern information systems have similar centralization. Major tech companies controlling access, single-copy digital files, critical data in specific locations. Distributed systems with redundancy are more resilient. Multiple copies in different locations protect against local catastrophes, but distribution requires coordination and resources. Simply distributing information isn't sufficient. Systems must ensure copies are maintained and accessible. Third, institutional support is crucial. The library thrived under royal patronage that valued learning. It declined when patronage eroded and priorities shifted. Modern research institutions face similar dependencies on governmental and private support. When societies stop valuing knowledge preservation, institutions supporting preservation weaken. This isn't abstract concern. Libraries worldwide face budget cuts. Archives operate with inadequate resources. Digital preservation projects struggle for funding. These decisions have long-term consequences. Fourth, some knowledge is irreplaceable. Once lost, it cannot be recreated. Primary sources, eyewitness accounts, original observations, These cannot be reconstructed if all copies disappear. Modern information abundance creates illusion of permanence. Everything seems accessible, suggesting it will always be so. But accessibility isn't permanence. Websites disappear. Digital files become unreadable. Languages die, taking their literature with them. The knowledge that seems omnipresent today could be tomorrow's lost texts if preservation fails. Fifth, preservation requires recognizing long-term value even when immediate utility isn't obvious. Ancient texts were lost, partly because later generations didn't value them. Medieval scribes reused parchment because they didn't recognize original text's importance. Modern society makes similar judgments. What gets preserved reflects contemporary values and perceived importance. Future generations may desperately need information we're currently discarding because we don't recognize its value. Comprehensive preservation is safer than selective, but it requires resources. Sixth, knowledge preservation is a civilization-level concern, not merely a technical problem. The library's fate was tied to broader political, economic, and cultural changes in the Mediterranean world. Preservation succeeded when civilization was stable and valued learning. It failed when instability, conflict, and changing values disrupted supporting institutions. Modern digital preservation similarly depends on civilization-level stability. It requires functioning technological infrastructure, political stability, economic resources, and cultural commitment to preservation. These aren't guaranteed permanently. The library's destruction represents one of history's great intellectual catastrophes. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, irreplaceable texts, unique perspectives, all lost. The magnitude of the loss is incalculable. We're still discovering its extent as scholarship identifies more lost works referenced in surviving sources. But the loss wasn't inevitable. Different choices, sustained institutional support, successful preservation efforts could have saved much. The library declined largely through neglect and gradual erosion, not unstoppable catastrophe. This makes the loss simultaneously tragic and instructive. Tragic because it was largely preventable. Instructive because it shows what happens when preservation fails. The lesson is clear. Knowledge preservation requires continuous commitment. Without it, even the greatest repositories can disappear. Modern society possesses knowledge and resources ancient Alexandria lacked. We understand preservation requirements. We can create redundant systems. We can digitize materials for wider access. We have global networks enabling cooperation. But we must actually use these capabilities. Technical capacity doesn't ensure preservation without institutional will and resource allocation. The question is whether we'll learn from Alexandria's fate. Will we maintain preservation systems even when immediate benefits aren't obvious? Will we fund libraries and archives adequately? Will we ensure digital information remains accessible long-term? Will we recognize that some losses are irreversible? Or will we repeat Alexandria's story? Will we allow preservation systems to erode through neglect? Will we make short-term decisions with long-term consequences? Will future generations look back, wondering what we lost that can never be recovered? The choice is ours. The Library of Alexandria is gone. What it contained is lost, but its lesson remains. Knowledge is fragile. Preservation requires effort, and the failure to preserve is a failure that echoes across centuries. If this exploration of one of history's greatest intellectual catastrophes provided insight into how civilizations preserve or lose knowledge, consider subscribing to this channel for more documentary investigations into the forces that shaped human history. Leave your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of the library's story resonates most with you? The gradual decline, the irreplaceable losses, the modern parallels? Discussions like these help us understand not just what happened, but what it means for us today. And if this hour-long investigation into what humanity lost when the Library of Alexandria disappeared was valuable, support this work with a like. It helps ensure content like this reaches others interested in understanding how knowledge survives or fails to survive across time. Until next time, remember that the past isn't simply history. It's a mirror showing us our own vulnerabilities and opportunities. The Library of Alexandria is gone. The question is, what we'll do to prevent the next Alexandria from happening on our watch?